Confederate States of America was a breakaway state led by many powerful and skilled leaders and generals. After the war, some leaders faced legal prosecution, some faced public scrutiny, and others flourished with successful careers after the war. Here are some of the most notable Confederate leaders and generals and what they did after the Civil War. Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. He was unanimously chosen by delegates from all of the Confederate states and served from 1861 to 1865. At the end of March 1865, Union forces broke through the Confederate lines and the Confederates were forced to abandon Richmond, the Confederate capital. Davis and his cabinet fled south via rail, unsuccessfully attempting to amass an army along the way. In Washington, Georgia, he officially dissolved the Confederate States of America and continued south to Irwinville. While camping outside Irwinville, Union forces discovered Davis's camp and arrested him. Davis was imprisoned in Fort Monroe, Virginia, and initially faced brutal conditions. He was imprisoned in a casemate, forced to wear fetters, barred from any outside contact, including his family, forced to have a guard in the room with him 24/7, and given only a Bible for entertainment. Due to public outcry, his conditions were slowly improved, and by September of 1866, Davis lived in a 4-bedroom apartment with his wife, Verena. The U.S. government knew they wanted to try Davis, but were unsure what for. They considered trying him for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln or the mistreatment of Union soldiers in Andersonville prison, but they could not find sufficient evidence tying Davis to either event. Eventually, they charged him with treason, but his lawyer argued that he could not have committed treason against the United States, as Mississippi had seceded and was no longer a part of the country. In 1867, Davis was released on bail and was forced to endure the most horrific punishment yet. He moved to Quebec. His children had moved to Quebec after Davis was arrested, and Verena and Davis joined their children up north. He remained in Quebec for a year, but returned to the United States following Johnston's proclamation on Christmas 1868, which pardoned all who took part in the rebellion. Upon his return to the United States, Davis was very poor, but despite this, he was very picky in which work he would accept. He turned down offers from Randolph-Macon College and the University of the South because he did not want to damage their reputation, and because the pay was insufficient. In 1869, Davis traveled to Britain and France, but found no work there either. He received countless offers to speak at events, but declined most. He did give the eulogy at Robert E. Lee's funeral. In 1870, Davis became the president of the Carolina Life Insurance Company, but resigned 3 years later due to the Panic of 1873. He continued working smaller jobs on and off up until 1877, when he moved on to Sarah Dorsey's home in Mississippi so she could write his memoirs. Dorsey died 2 years later and left the home to Davis. Davis lived in that home until his death in 1889. He died while on vacation in Louisiana. More than 200,000 mourners attended his funeral, and he was buried in Richmond, Virginia upon Verena's request. When Verena died in 1906, she was buried next to him. Alexander H. Stephens. Alexander H. Stephens served as the Vice President of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. Despite his position, he strongly opposed secession for the entire war and often criticized President Davis's policies. He had even been a political ally to Lincoln in the 1840s and met with him nearing the end of the war in an attempt to stop the fighting. At the end of the war, Stephens did not flee from Union forces and was arrested for treason in his home on May 11, 1865. He was imprisoned for 5 months, but was released in October of 1865. Alexander Stephens was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1866, but was barred from taking his seat due to the restrictions on former Confederate leaders. He then wrote a book on the history of America, defending secession and calling the war Northern aggression. In 1873, Stephens was elected to the House of Representatives and was re-elected in 1874, 1876, 1878, and 1880. In November of 1882, Stephens was elected governor of Georgia, but died just 4 months into his term. Alexander Stephens' post-Civil War career proved to be much more successful than Jefferson Davis's. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, or simply General Lee, is in my opinion the most iconic man of the Confederate States. He was the best general to fight for the Confederates, and by the end of the war held the title of General-in-Chief of the Armies of the Confederate States. It was also General Lee who surrendered to General Grant and began peace negotiations in the Appomattox courthouse. After his surrender, Lee was not arrested, and the only punishments he faced were temporarily losing the right to vote as well as having some of his property seized. His home was actually turned into Arlington Cemetery. In 1866, Lee encouraged all remaining Confederate fighters to surrender, and throughout his later life, supported reconciliation rather than holding a grudge towards the North. He supported free public schooling for African Americans, but did oppose the 15th Amendment. Originally, Lee had hoped to retire to his farm, but due to his notoriety, this proved to be impossible, so he accepted an offer to become president of Washington College. In a further attempt at reconciliation, Lee ensured that many Northerners came to Washington College and ensured that they were treated well by their Southern peers. Lee even met with his old foe, President Grant, at the White House in 1869. Lee generally avoided politics after the war. He did support multiple Democratic candidates, but stayed generally indifferent and never ran for any political positions. On September 28, 1870, just 5 years after the end of the war, Lee suffered a stroke and died 2 weeks later. He was buried in Lexington, Virginia, on the grounds of Washington College. P.G.T Beauregard. P.G.T Beauregard was perhaps the most notable Confederate general besides General Lee. General Beauregard commanded the Confederate forces in the Battle of Fort Sumter, the battle that began the Civil War, and played a crucial role in many notable battles, such as the First Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Shiloh, and more. After the war, Beauregard reluctantly took an oath of loyalty to the United States. At first, he considered leaving the country as Brazilian, Egyptian, and Romanian armies wanted to hire him as a general. He considered these offers, but ultimately began working as chief engineer and general superintendent of a railway company. He also entered the world of politics in 1876 after President Grant pardoned him from any wrongdoing and allowed him to enter politics. He worked with black politicians in favor of black rights with the aim of voting out radical Republicans that were holding back Reconstruction in Louisiana. He was also responsible for bringing cable cars to New Orleans, and after leaving the railroad company, struck it rich advertising for the Louisiana lottery. Beauregard continued to work multiple different jobs up until he died in his sleep in 1893. Joseph E. Johnston. Joseph E. Johnston was a senior commander in the Civil War, and despite his skills and effective strategies, his achievements were often overshadowed by his fellow generals, partially due to his poor relationship with President Davis. At the end of the war, General Johnston was put in charge of a large number of troops, and Union Generals Grant and Sherman praised his actions on the battlefield. And Generals Johnston, Sherman, and Grant remained great friends for the rest of their lives. After the war, Johnston served as an executive in the railroad and insurance business, eventually serving 1 term in the House of Representatives. Johnston died of pneumonia just 10 days after attending General Sherman's funeral in the pouring rain. Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a prominent plantation owner and slave trader before the Civil War. He immediately enlisted when the war began. He had no requirement to join, as most plantation owners were exempt from service. Forrest enlisted due to sheer passion for the Confederate cause. He was an extremely skilled cavalryman and notably massacred hundreds of surrendered troops, many of whom were African American, in the Battle of Fort Pillow. 2 years after the war, Forrest was made the Grand Wizard of a new white supremacist organization, the Ku Klux Klan. In the late 1860s, the KKK suppressed black voting rights by intimidating black voters at polling stations and used violence to scare away any potential voters. After becoming disillusioned with the violence and lack of organization in the Klan, Forrest left the organization. After lynchings and violence continued, Forrest entered politics and began advocating for black rights and harsh punishments for white offenders who committed violent crimes against African Americans. Forrest died in his Tennessee home in 1877 due to complications of diabetes. Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson is the only man on this list that died during the war. Jackson was General Lee's right-hand man and one of the most successful Confederate generals. His death was quite a strange one. Upon returning to camp on May 2, 1863, Jackson and his men were fired upon, as the men at camp believed Union cavalry were attacking. After Jackson shouted at the Confederate troops to hold their fire, Major Berry proclaimed, "It's a damned Yankee trick, fire," and Confederate troops opened fire on Jackson again. Jackson was rushed to a nearby plantation to be treated for his wounds, but died 8 days later. Along with Jackson, several of Jackson's advisors, soldiers, and horses were killed in the incident. George Pickett. George Pickett, often considered an idiotic and hot-headed man, gained notoriety in the Civil War, mostly for Pickett's charge, a bloody offensive in the Battle of Gettysburg led by General Pickett. After the war, Pickett fled to Canada fearing prosecution. After General Grant persuaded him to return to Virginia, he attempted to rejoin the army. He was denied and then tried his hand at farming, and finally began working for an insurance agency. He died in 1875, aged 50. There are many Confederate generals I would have loved to cover, like James Longstreet, William Anderson, A.P. Hill, and more, but I didn't want to make this video too long, so if you did enjoy this, let me know, and I will make a part 2 with some other generals I couldn't get around to.